Gracias. Well, thank you everyone very much for being here today in the Gender and International Relations online conference in its second day. Right now we have the honor to have Dr. Courtney Burns, who's gonna give a conference titled Unpacking the Concepts, Examining the Link Between Women's Status and Terrorism. Right now, I will give the word to Mariela Pajes, who will act as our moderator today. So Mariela, you have the word.
Thank you, Tadeo. So now I'm going to proceed to present Dr. Courtney Burns. She's assistant professor at Bucknell University. She received her PhD from the University of Missouri in 2015. She studies the foreign and domestic policies of women chief executives, and her research interests are gender and leadership, foreign and domestic policies of women presidents and prime ministers, conflict, and the impact of representation and gender equality on international processes. Without anything else to add, now I yield you the floor, Dr. Burns. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Am I able to share my screen with a presentation? Yes, okay, great. Oh, it says disabled.
Okay, let me fix it for you.
Thank you.
Are you able now?
No, but let me try one more time. No, it still says disabled.
Okay, let me do this. Jaciel, are you there?
Sí, en el cuadro verde que dice Share Screen, tiene una flechita. Le das en la flechita y trae una opción que dice Allow multiple participants to share.
Dale. Okay, I'll share with you the host so you can help me with that, okay?
Sí.
Thank you. Okay, you have the host now.
Dr. Courtney.
Yep, it is working now. I got it. Perfect. All right. Well, I want to thank you for having me. This is such an awesome opportunity. I've been telling all my colleagues I was found on TikTok and I get to give a guest presentation for that. So I love that. I think it's part of the reason why I'm on TikTok is to get to do that. So today I'm presenting a project that I do have co-authored with a colleague of mine named Kyle Cattleman. He's at Fairleigh Dickinson University, which is outside of New York City. And in this project, we are interested in examining the question, what effect does an increase in women's status have on domestic terrorist attacks? And in particular, we're interested in this question because there's been this kind of growing movement to understand the relationship that women have on the amount of extremist violence in countries, on political violence. And I'll get into some of those findings on the next slide, but also just in the policy world, especially following 9/11, we saw a growth in politicians, and particularly the United States, but also with, say, the feminist foreign policy movement that Sweden started and Mexico has adopted, this idea that when you fight against terrorism, you will help improve women's rights. In fact, in 2001, Laura Bush was quoted as saying, the fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. And as a kind of byproduct of this belief, George W. Bush signed the Afghan Women and Children Relief Act, which was a central goal of the terrorists is the brutal oppression of women, he said, not just women of Afghanistan. And then along comes Malala Yousafzai, who is also, kind of famous for the attempted assassination, given that she was this very vocal proponent of the education of girls. And so she said, we know terrorists are afraid of the power of education. Now, we were especially interested, given this kind of preponderance in saying that there's some kind of link here between terrorists and the rights of women and girls, to break this down a little bit and argue and specifically look at does the type of status, so women's security, women's inclusion, and women's rights, again, I'll get into this a little bit more, have an effect on the amount of activity from specific terrorist organizations. So if we also break down terrorist organizations by ideology, looking at right-wing, left-wing, nationalists, and religious groups. And so this was kind of like wondering, is there actually something going on? And as I mentioned, a lot of this grew out of, there's kind of a lot of research that's found that when there are more women present in governments in particular, usually looking at legislatures and parliaments, those countries are less bellicose in their relations with other countries, so they're less violent. Now, there's also kind of a potential problem in this research in that generally they theoretically, rather than linking women in government specifically to less bellicosity, they usually frame it as gender equality. And this is a little bit of a problem theoretically because women's inclusion in government does not necessarily mean gender equality. And so we also were interested in kind of parsing out this concept of, rather than specifically talking about gender equality, really focusing on the mechanism of women's status in society. Also, there's been a growing amount of research, it's primarily on countries in the Middle East, that finds that when women are more included in society, they tend to hamper the spread of extremist ideologies, broadly speaking, across people. And this is especially the case if they're more likely to be employed or in schools. So it's not necessarily holding in government, but it's like in society, broadly speaking, when women are there, they serve as potentially a veto player. So they stop the spread of these ideologies. They also kind of stop the spread of these ideologies to their own children, for example, some research is finding. And then finally, the research that has been done on women's rights and terrorism has specifically looked at women's rights. And this is women's political, economic, and social rights. And as you'll see kind of on the next slide, women's rights is really a very small subset of the treatment of women broadly in society. And in fact, many times women can be granted rights, but they're not realized. So they might be legislated, but they're not actually carried out. And so we kind of argue that women's rights is a very limited understanding of women in society, and women's rights are not necessarily fully carried out. And so we posit that we need to go a step further. And so that's what we do in our research. So when we talk about unpacking the concepts, as the title of the paper says, so what is this? What is women's security, women's inclusion, and women's rights? Well, we take this framework from two people that are, they're based in the US, but this is kind of an interesting project that they're doing. Their names are Karim, K-R-I-M, and Hill, if you're interested in this data. And they started looking instead at just women's rights, because that's where we've been kind of limited in terms of data, if we want to look at this quantitatively, which of course could be criticized in its own right, to really kind of broadening our understanding of women's place in society. And so when we talk about women's security, what we're talking about is women's safety from hunger, from disease, from repression, and protection from sudden and hurtful disruptions in daily life. So this indicator is more an indicator of women's bodily autonomy in society. Also included in women's security is the idea that women are free from domestic violence, relatively speaking, from the chance of rape, relatively speaking. And so it really is a measure of what's the status of women's bodily autonomy in a country. Women's inclusion is referencing women's ability to be visible and equal in society. And so this is measured by looking at women's inclusion in government and in the workforce. So that's what inclusion means. Again, different from security. And then women's rights is what we've traditionally been measuring. These are the government's legal attempts to protect women. So it's different from inclusion because if we think about women could legally be granted the right to work, but they might not work in large numbers. So we've seen this in a number of cases. Saudi Arabia is a good example where women are granted the right to work, but a very small portion of women actually work. And so there is also a difference here that these categories are exclusive from one another in a sense. And so what we think might be going on is that these individual indicators might matter differently to terrorism. And so that's part of what we investigate. Now, what about unpacking the concepts of type of terrorism? Lots of research on terrorism, broadly speaking, suffers from a problem or something we call a problem of pooling terrorism. They treat all kinds of terrorism the same. And there's been a growing movement to disentangle types of terrorism. It's relatively new, but we focus on 4 types of terrorism: right-wing, left-wing, ethno-nationalist, and religious. And so we don't include lone wolf terrorism, so to speak, unless a group has claimed an attack. So sometimes, one person goes out and conducts a terrorist attack and then no group claims it. We don't include that kind of terrorism. Instead, it has to be easily attributable to a specific organization. So right-wing terrorism is primarily a reactionary type of terrorism. It's motivated by anti-government sentiment and preservation of the status quo. We're more likely to see right-wing terrorism in established, stable, long-lasting democracies than we are in other places. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's more frequent. And that's because of the ideology of right-wing terrorism is about preservation of a status quo that's been established for a long time. Left-wing terrorism is rooted in Marxism. So we have Marxist groups like the Maoists in Nepal, or Shining Path in Peru, or FARC in Colombia. An example of right-wing, for example, is the Combat 18 in the UK. So those are some examples. Ethno-nationalist terrorism are groups that are, we use ethno-nationalists and nationalists interchangeably, but generally it's rooted around some kind of drive for separatism, some kind of, territorial autonomy, separatism from a government, but usually around some kind of ethnic identity. So the IRA, for example, that's a religious identity, but, ethnicity and religion can sometimes be closely intertwined, or the ETA Basque separatists are also an example of an ethno-nationalist group. And then finally, religious terrorism, perhaps obviously Al-Qaeda, for example, but also the Temple Mount. So generally, our data is primarily Islamist, or it's primarily Islamist based, but not entirely. There are also some Jewish groups included. Now, what's important to kind of understand in terms of how can we actually disentangle these types of groups? Like, don't ethno-nationalists like the IRA have religious motivations as well? The key here is that we analyzed and used other sources of data to back this up, who also analyzed what was the primary motivation of a terrorist group. And so that's how a group fell within these categorizations, is by looking at the primary motivation. So while the IRA, religion certainly plays a role with them, their primary motivation was separatism from the UK. Okay, so we have, again, a question about what impact does improvements of women's status have on different types of terrorist groups' activity. Our theory is very much grounded in understanding the relationship between masculinity and misogyny. And so let's establish a couple definitions. The first is masculinity. Masculinity is made up of several different traits that are socially ascribed. I said described there, that's a typo, are socially ascribed characteristics and attributes of men. And the different types of attributes and characteristics of men can vary cross-nationally, but by and large, we argue that masculinity is fairly pervasive for men, just like femininity is fairly pervasive for women, that you are supposed to perform certain traits in order to be kind of taken seriously by society or viewed as normal, quote unquote. Along the same line is something called misogyny. Now, we use a definition established by Mann that misogyny is a political phenomenon whose purpose is to police and enforce women's subordination and to uphold male dominance. In many respects, misogyny is an ideology. And it's an ideology of nostalgia. It's a nostalgia for a time when women were subordinate to a hegemonic male. And so it's an ideology that's really an offshoot of masculinity, but it's different from masculinity. So a lot of research in political science kind of started with the understanding, oh, it's masculinity and pressures of masculinity that drive men to be violent. But we disagree with this assertion. We argue, and this is based on some work by Diaz and Valji, that misogyny actually serves as a gateway driver to societal violence, and that you're more likely to see misogyny in extremist organizations than in kind of regular everyday folks. Diaz and Valji do some work primarily on industrialized democracies, looking at some of the lone wolf terrorists that conducted violence. And what they found across many of these individuals was that they all had some level in their manifestos about hatred of women. And in fact, many men who become violent are usually violent towards women first. And this is really misogyny at play, not necessarily masculinity. And so the idea is that there are social pressures placed on men to be masculine, but the pressure of masculinity is not enough to drive men to violence. If it was, we would see a lot more violence than we already, I mean, we see a lot of violence, but we'd see a lot more violence because there are pressures all the time on men to be masculine. Instead, masculinity that distills into misogyny, when someone becomes a misogynist, this is the gateway to becoming really indiscriminately violent. And this is based on the idea of something called hegemonic masculinity. So R.W. Connell came up with this kind of framework for masculinity, where hegemonic masculinity is kind of the top, most desired type of masculinity. It's the type of masculinity that many men are trying to live up to in society. And then along the pyramid are different types of masculinity, down to the bottom where you see subordinate masculinity. So subordinate masculinity is often the masculinity of like gay men. Marginalized masculinity might be men of color or men from a different social class. And these types of masculinity are not necessarily hegemonic. Hegemonic masculinity in many places is about, being a straight man, a breadwinner, tough, perhaps rational, although that can vary across time. But the key to maintaining this hierarchy of masculinity is violence. So what happens when a woman challenges this hierarchy, or what happens when a gay man challenges this hierarchy, is violence to try and keep them in place. And so we argue that because misogyny is an ideology of nostalgia, they need violence to kind of keep the status quo in place. And they use this violence indiscriminately. So it may be that the status of women is changing, But this triggers indiscriminate violence in an attempt to maintain the status quo, generally speaking. We'll talk about how this varies a little bit from group to group, but that's the general takeaway. So, we don't believe that's the pressure to perform masculinity that necessarily makes people violent. That pressure is near universal. Instead, it's individuals who are misogynists. They have a strong desire to reinforce a specific type of society with women subordinated that are violent and seek to maintain this hierarchy. Okay, so how does this all relate together then? There's a lot of moving parts here. We argue that right-wing religious and nationalist groups have stronger ties to masculinity and gender issues, making them more likely to distill into misogyny than left-wing groups. It doesn't mean that left-wing groups are free from masculinity and gender issues, but masculinity and gender are not as salient to them. It's not kind of key to their ideology, as opposed to right-wing religious and nationalist groups. So left-wing groups, typically Marxist groups, are not as concerned with women's place in society. In fact, they often recruit women into their ranks. Doesn't mean that they're great to women. Many Marxist groups, if they take over in government, don't necessarily include women, but it's not so much a part of their ideology to subvert women. Unlike right-wing religious and nationalist groups, which do have various mechanisms tying a subversion to women in place. So, for example, nationalist groups are deeply tied to the narrative around gender and nationhood. For example, colonialism has been a major impetus to tying nationalism to gender. Cynthia Enlow has some great work in Bananas, Beaches, and Bases that talks about colonialism as a male adventure, that when it first set out, it was Western men going out to, take all these barbaric societies and make them civilized. And it usually was through a process of feminizing local men and marrying local women. And this actually set off a second process of the local men who've been feminized kind of wanting to reassert themselves and reassert their dominance over, quote unquote, their women. And so colonialization has played a role in this, as well as the general story around statehood, that it's the motherland that needs to be protected, and that women's roles in these kind of nationalist groups is to have kids and to produce the next population while the men go out to protect them, to be the warriors, to create the state. So it highlights this kind of public-private divide that exists, where women's place is in the private sphere and men's place is in the public sphere. For religious groups, we also, a lot of feminist work has been done showing that all of the major world religions are rooted in patriarchal beliefs that men are the moral authority in society and women are subservient to them. This is a major part of their ideology. And so we see this in some of the manifestos of some of the terrorist organizations. But even if it's not explicitly stated, this is certainly an understanding within religious groups, is that men have a certain place in society and women also have a certain place in society. And then with right-wing groups, there's also a birth narrative, but it's a little less tied to how the nationalist groups have their birth narrative. It's very much tied to kind of a racist undertone, like in the United States, protecting whiteness and having white people produce babies to oppose immigrants that are coming in, for example. But it's still also about birth rates, but it's reactionary in its nature. As I mentioned, right-wing groups are reactionary. So it's like, oh, this is happening, quick, have babies, as opposed to nationalist groups where it's like, no, your purpose is to have babies. But either way, right-wing groups, they do also have this kind of narrative around women's place in society, and it is subservient to men, and their job is to make sure that the ideology continues on in future generations by having babies generally. So what we posit is that the foundations or the ideologies of right-wing religious and nationalist groups are based upon the idea that men are superior to women, and in fact distill into misogyny because they have extremist views, and they rely on violence to maintain a certain status, to maintain their ideology. So in terms of the different statuses, when we think about women's security and how this denotes women's bodily autonomy, and in particular, it's their ability to control their own sexuality, like being free from domestic violence, being free from rape, we argue that ethno-nationalists and religious groups will find this especially threatening, in particular because of how deeply rooted the birth narrative is in their ideologies, that women are simply exist to produce the next population, and that they need to be in the home and taking care of children. And so we argue that changes in women's security, in particular in improvements, will in fact trigger ethno-nationalist and religious group violence as opposed to right-wing violence. And that's because right-wing groups are reactionary. And so we think that they'll be less influenced by women's security and more influenced by women's inclusion and rights. Recall that I mentioned that most right-wing violence, like the vast majority of it, something around 95% of it, is happening in Europe, the United States, Canada. It's happening in places that are established, kind of long-lived democracies. And so in this way, they're more reactionary to changes in women's inclusion and rights. So they're more likely to be threatened here. In particular, when we think about women's inclusion, women in government or employment are salient threats to right-wing groups. In fact, in some interviews, Kimmel, a scholar, did interviews with right-wing groups and found that women's employment and education, as well as perceived special treatment of women on the global stage, drove their motivations of rage. So this reaction to women getting a special place in society made right-wing groups particularly angry. We also think that women's rights will trigger right-wing terrorism because the passage of new laws alters the status quo. So right-wing groups are attempting to maintain a status quo where they once felt more privileged than they do in current times, this kind of perceived notion of privilege. And another kind of important part here is that because these groups exist in established states, usually with free press, many of these changes, women in government, employment, or passage of new laws, will be much more likely to be in the media, for example, again, kind of triggering a reactionary response on the part of right-wing groups. So this leads us to three hypotheses. An increase in women's security in a state will lead to increases in terrorist attacks from ethno-nationalists and religious groups. Increases in women's inclusion in a state will lead to an increase in terrorist attacks from right-wing groups, and increases in women's rights in a state will lead to an increase in attacks from right-wing groups. So essentially what we're positing is that there are different mechanisms at play for different women's status indicators and also different terrorist organizations. We test this on a series of 185 countries from 1970 to 2014. Our data comes from the Global Terrorism Database and START, and then my co-author did some coding as well of terrorist organizations. We use our status indicators for women's status, inclusion, and rights. And then we have a whole series of control variables. I didn't put them in the paper, but I can certainly talk about how they perform, or in my presentation, but I can talk about how they perform if anyone's really curious about that. But essentially, we control for lots of different variables that might explain why countries have terrorism. These are kind of traditional variables that have been included in past research. And if anyone is very curious, we conduct a negative binomial model because there are a lot of zeros. A lot of countries don't have terrorism. And so because of this kind of inflation of zeros, this is the model that we choose. Just if you're curious, this is what the breakdown looks like across different types. You can see that left-wing and ethno-nationalist are actually our most frequent type of terrorist attacks. I didn't get the graph. I meant to grab a graph and I forgot to, but these also vary across time. Left-wing terrorism was really frequent in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s kind of significantly drops off, while religious upticks. So there's kind of a difference across time for much of this violence, depending on ideology, which is nice that we can look at it across time and still kind of see what we find. So in terms of our models, essentially what we do is we have support for the hypothesis about ethno-nationalists and religious groups. There is an uptick in violence whenever women's status increases. In fact, a 1 standard deviation increase in women's security rights results in a 69% rate increase in attacks from ethno-nationalist groups and a 41% increase in religious groups. Interestingly, I mean, we didn't really theorize this, but it doesn't go against our theory at all. But you can see an increase in security, right? Security actually decreases left-wing attacks. Again, doesn't really go against our theory per se, but was something we didn't think was necessarily going to be statistically significant. We also have support that for right-wing groups, when women's rights improve, this also triggers attacks. So we have support for those two hypotheses. Interestingly, and this surprised us, women's inclusion does not come up significant in any of the models. It's positive for nationalists and religious groups, but it is in fact not significant. So we can't really draw any conclusions. And we weren't really sure about this finding on negative, the fact that an increase in legal rights could decrease nationalist attacks. This is something that we want to investigate with future work, that what is it about this that might matter? There's a large kind of narrative in the literature that sometimes women are granted rights as a legitimacy factor to international actors. And so perhaps something's going on there, but we weren't entirely sure. So in terms of what we conclude, improvements to women's security status does appear to increase the rate of attacks across nationalist and religious groups, and improvements in legal rights does appear to increase attacks from right-wing groups. Now, there were, questions about this. Well, what about left-wing groups? The fact that there's so much activity from them, and there are a series of attacks that go unclaimed. And so one of the things that we did just to make sure that, in fact, our results were holding was we ran a model where we took all of those unclaimed attacks and we ran it on a small data set that looks at attacks of women. So specifically, it's about 1,100 attacks that are known of terrorist attacks against women. And we find that 70% of those attacks happen in countries that don't have any left-wing terrorist violence happening. And so we kind of argue that this is a robustness check to our results, that it does appear to be the case that left-wing groups are not targeting women specifically, and so they're not as reactionary to changes to women's status as opposed to right-wing nationalist or religious groups. So that's one type of way that we try to double check this. Another way that we tried to double check this was with religion. In particular, after September 11th, religious terrorism was primarily driven by Al-Qaeda and Islamist organizations. And so we disaggregated religious groups from Islamist and the rest. And we do find that increases in security, women's security, led to attacks from Islamist groups, while increases in inclusion increased non-Islamic groups. So something else to kind of think about going forward, but wasn't a huge part of our paper, but it still holds that misogyny is playing a role here in terms of why terrorist organizations are altering their activity. So what are some of the conclusions that we can draw from this research? In particular, we think that women's rights, this concept is not all encompassing of gender equality, that we need to disentangle it. And we also need to disentangle what terrorism is, the different types of terrorism and the different mechanisms at play. And in particular, we argue that misogyny is a key explanation for why groups engage in indiscriminate violence, as opposed to the pressures of masculinity. So that's a big conclusion. I want to end so that there will be some time for questions. So thank you. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic. And I thank you very much for this incredible participation. I think I speak for everyone when I say that this talk has taught us a lot about this important topic. And now, well, as you said, I would like to move on to the question and answer section. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Very good. Okay, so I'm gonna explain the dynamic. The dynamic is gonna be as it follows. Meeting participants who have any questions and have the opportunity to open their microphone can raise their virtual hand to give them the floor. Likewise, those who do not have the opportunity to open their microphone can write their question in the chat meeting, and we can pass it. Okay, so we're gonna give a minute if anyone wants to make a question, and if not, you can also make like a comment or give a point of view. I don't know, is anyone who wants to? Okay, yes, Tadeo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mariela. Well, first, thank you very much, Dr. Burns, for your presentation. I think it was very enlightening, and it's a topic I do consider very interesting to analyze regarding the different types of terrorism, as you say. My question goes in relation to what you said about colonialism and how colonialism acted as a male adventure and how this drives violence in its application, which is obviously violent in its very nature, not just like militarily speaking, but obviously epistemologically speaking as well. So do you think that this misogynistic drive violence is more, let's say, it's bigger or it's more marked in post-colonial countries? Like, do you think it's a correlation in there, or do you think it is not a correlation there? Thank you.
That's a good question. I don't think that post-colonial countries are more at risk of misogyny than the colonizing countries. I think misogyny is prevalent in all societies. So that's a really interesting question, though. Given that kind of extremist violence it's a rare occurrence. In some countries, it's not rare, but across the board, it's a rare occurrence. So this tells me that in terms of misogyny, it's not necessarily endemic to a specific location per se. Does that answer your question? Is that what you were asking?
Yes, doctor. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So we have another question from Maria Fernanda Gonzalez. Maria Fernanda, you can open your microphone, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for giving us some time of your agenda to give us this conference. My question is regarding some of the models you mentioned and the variables you had to use for your research. Could you perhaps go on a bit about that, please?
Yeah. So we controlled for a whole host of, in fact, if I could pull up, are you interested in seeing the full models? I can pull that up really quick.
Yes, if you have on hand your information, you can also share your content, please.
I have the PDF. So let me just scroll to where our models are, and then I can share my screen, and so you can see how they are performed. Generally, they all perform, like those variables performed as you would expect, but let me get there and then share. Okay, so I just grabbed, I took a screenshot from the top of this table. So this paper is forthcoming in the Journal of JPR, Journal of Peace Research. And so this is for peer review. It was the final accepted version of this paper. So I don't have like a nice PDF of it. So what you can see here is all of our control variables. We have GDP, area, population. Essentially, we control for these because these are other explanations for why terrorism might occur in a country. And so despite controlling for all of these, our variables on women's security and women's rights still come up significant. So generally speaking, countries that are very large countries that are large are less likely to see terrorism. Some of this is like, how do you spread out, how do you act in terms of terrorism when it's close together? It's easier to conduct attacks. Conflict, if a country's in conflict, it tended to increase attacks from, I think this is ethno-nationalist and right-wing. Countries with ethnic fractionalization, although there's questions around how this measure is taken, increases left-wing and ethno-nationalist, which doesn't necessarily surprise us. Polity is a regime type. And what this finds is that democracies were more likely to see ethno-nationalist and left-wing, while democracy decreased the likelihood of right-wing, which is kind of an interesting finding. And then Cold War is just a dummy variable. Like, was it during the Cold War? Was it not? So the Cold War saw a lot of ethno-nationalists and left-wing violence and less religious. Physical integrity rights, these are human rights violations. So the idea is that when human rights violations are up, so is terrorism. And this is the case for religious groups. So generally speaking, these performed as we would expect. Countries with large number of terrorist organizations also saw an increase in attacks. So does that answer your question? Do you have anything specific about any of these controls?
Could you perhaps go a bit into the ethnic fractionalization? I am not quite clear on that.
Yeah, so ethnic fractionalization is an attempt. Honestly, it's quite a poor attempt, but we use it because it's what people use in the literature to try and take into account how heterogeneous or homogeneous a country is in terms of ethnicity. So countries that, like Japan, for example, which is a largely homogeneous society, would not be considered ethnically fractionalized. The idea is that when a country has lots of different ethnic groups, they're more likely to see different types of violence. And this is getting at the idea that some ethnic groups might be oppressed. And so they have a higher likelihood of having a grievance. And so that's the theory behind the variable. Again, it's kind of a poorly measured variable. It's one we were criticized for having, but it's a common control and it's not primarily part of our theory. So we kept it in, but I think there's been some movement to try and get a better variable, but that's kind of what we have as it stands right now. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much, Doctor.
Well, thank you very much. Is there any other question in the forum? You can answer. You can raise your virtual hand, or you can write it in the chat. If not, that would be everything, and I would let the floor to Tadeo so he can close the conference. Thank you very much for giving us a little time of your values agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, Dr. Burns, again, thank you very much. In the name of the Director of the Faculty of Law and Social Science of the Autonomous University of Puebla and the coordination of the degree of International Relations, we're very thankful for your conference. As Mariela said, it's a great opportunity having you here. In the course of this or next week, we'll send to your email the official participation diploma. So thank you very much again, and sorry if there was any type of misunderstanding regarding the time zones.
That's on me. That's on me. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much and have an amazing day, Doctor.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening.